All right, let's try to get a feel for the basic confrontation of Heidegger with the prevalent notions of time. Um, so let's bypass the Augustinian de rigueur, usually de rigueur version, but only talk about um, the ones directly that had a bearing on the discussion in physics in Heidegger's time, which were determinant for him. So, why did Heidegger decide to go into philosophy instead of physics? He was sort of, so to speak, had a co-major. Um, so, in Leibniz, you get um, a different account than in Newton. As in everything, there's some controversy. Did Leibniz read the Principia and re-engineer it or something like that? There's a video um, on the Lex Friedman thing, as some guys saying, "Oh, there's a case to be made for this and so on." But there's always a case to be made for everything, I think. I mean, for example, I was just not to go too far deviant on this, but I was thinking of Schleiermacher's remark that in philology, nobody actually knows the ancient languages, which is to say, what was really going on with the ancient Latini, for example, we don't know. We have written records, but there's no videotape, there's no audio tape. We don't know what daily life is generally like. We know some records, and then uh, sensu stricto, somebody could say the fact that there's not that many pronouns show up in Latin writing, Caesar's famous saying, and so on. Veni, vidi, vici, where the I, the ego, so of course Latin has the word I or ego, the pronoun, just as it also has other pronouns, but it doesn't show up that much in speech, and usually you got this petty problem in translations that if the translator doesn't really know their stuff, then they, going by the verb tense, they don't know who to assign the word to in the translation where the pronouns will appear. Stuff like that. But then you get a genuine question of how, what were people doing in ordinary life? Were they taking that shortened way of speaking as the most direct way of speaking, or did they more often specify the pronoun so they could be more likely to get into a situation like the current situation where the pronoun is always, and that's a philosophic issue. We should remember that touches on the Cartesian issue, whether all the acts, as Kant would have called it, all the acts of the manifold acts of the Cartesian subject were centered around a pronoun-bearing entity, or whether we could conceive of them as as free from that entity in some way. That's one of the things, basically, a question with Heidegger, with Kant, in this sort of Kant and Descartes, and so how does Kant? Let's say, so let's put that. So that gets us back to what we're trying to get at. So how does Kant link up with this discussion of Leibniz, Newton, Kant? So Leibniz position is time has no quantity and has a principled philosophic reason for doing this, which kind of reminds of Jung's often repeated saying that the old Democritus thought of the atoms atome, which means tome means to slice. So the atoms are the things that it's like the word amoral. Atoms are the things that take no part in further slicing out. Were ensouled. That the atomes were the atoms were ensouled. But what does that mean that they're ensouled? So putting aside what Democritus meant by that, let's say, what does Leibniz mean in his monadology when he's sort of following this? His point is time is happening in the inner world, in the anoia, or talking to oneself inside, as much as in the logos as it happens in the universe, in the outside, or nature. Use this. Immediate attempts to close that down by saying that what's ever happening in the inner world is actually happening in the brain. It seems to me, then there's this circus of buffoonish claims about where do you point when you point to yourself. The atheists like to say they point to the brain, whereas primitive man points to his chest, or beats his chest, or maybe point to the stomach, or maybe point to the heart, as Aristotle did. But I would say you point nowhere, because it's not happening in nature. That's what Leibniz says. And this would also include where geometry, strictly speaking, happens, where we know, we all may not be able to imagine perfectly a square and a circle, but we can all think perfectly four-sided object, three-sided object. So far as, perfectly meaning just however anyone wants to understand what perfectly means. I give that example, but then it's there's real ambiguity in that. It's not just because we've made a mistake. And it's also not that we should just pretend there is no ambiguity and just say everybody must just say four sides, three sides, and don't think any further about whether there's further clarity, as analytic philosophy does, and then they congratulate themselves on being so clear. That's almost the entire thing with analytic philosophy, is ignoring the real situation, the things themselves, in order for false clarity to come into power. It's very British. I think it's super British. So Leibniz makes that split, which I think is totally intelligible. And then he says time happens in both equally, and so he doesn't want to do it the way Newton does it. Now, how does Newton do it? And then his monadology, which is written in French, and Heidegger was trying to read French, which shows that he was interested in that. Heidegger couldn't justify doing scholarly work on the monadology if he didn't speak French, so he was trying to learn French better. And also, I suppose, for the sake of the matter itself, I'm putting that backward, I guess, from Heidegger's point of view. Just as we mentioned, the Schleiermacher issue, he also needs to speak French, and is closest way to the scholarly, not the current French, but the French of the diplomatic, scholarly world of Leibniz time, the 18th century. In those days, diplomats weren't like today. Diplomats had to learn whole strategies and principles, because they were traveling a long way, and they had to discuss things thoroughly with the people that they came into contact with. And besides, conditions were different in many other ways. But okay, so Newton, in contrast to all those problems that Leibniz has, fixes time as a quantity, so that then that goes on to the Einstein and the EPR paper. The EPR paper says basically the conditions for physical reality, even though they've come through Minkowski and all this stuff, and even though there's the curvature, and there's this risk of almost the math being totally decoupled from anything but it works. Like, the math doesn't mean anything except that it predicts that it works. Whereas Einstein wants it still to describe reality. That's the question of time here. So if time is a quantity, it's measurable, it involves every calculation, then you have this, what Einstein's called the physical reality in your equation, which is when you go to statistics, you don't have that. When you go to just some kind of Monty Hall problem, you don't have that. Or just the thing that was connected to the recent Nobel Prize, that Ramsey type math, the theorem. But then so let's say there's the time is in ordo, the Leibniz version, but it's not a physical quantity. And then 2, time is a physical quantity, Newton. And then 3, Kant says time is nous. Time is the pure intuition. So they just say, like I was having a discussion online just now, and somebody is saying being is the definition, and what you understood by the definition is the what. Yeah, not the that, the two einei, but just the what. And so in this way, Kant is saying time is something that nous, which simply identifies the what as a kind of pure perception, is active in identifying time. And then when he goes into the questions, but then Kant's problem is that he's both a realist and an idealist simultaneously, so that he maintains basically the Cartesian position. So he maintains that both the world as we perceive it with nous is real. The types of things are real, trees, butterflies, mathematical objects. The typing is real, but also Kant maintains the phenomenology, the phenomenon understood in this Kantian sense, the stuff of nature, which conforms totally to Newton's laws, that's the point, is also real. So Kant has this further problem where he tries to fit that together. But okay, so then starting with those pictures, and in the case of Newton, the core position in connection to modern physics, but which of course has lapsed because quantum physics. Remember that guy? There was that guy Leonard Susskind. I think he's even still alive. He did these videos, which are totally good on the transition from classic physics, where you could treat time as reversible in the Newtonian physics, because it's just a quantity. I think in Leibniz you can't do that because there's things inside the monads that are happening just as are corresponding to dianoia, and in a way to Peirce. Remember this guy Peirce, the so-called pragmatist? He said the smallest particles can learn. That's another form of the same thesis in a way. It's not precisely the same because he doesn't specify that they have an inner being in the sense of the split between dianoia and logos, or speech and inner speech. But it's suggestive in a way. But in Heidegger, what he wants to say is this approach, there's a pronoun problem with this approach, and especially in the way Descartes has stated it. So Descartes has stated it this way basically because in his time it became a mania to say that the secondary qualities, the color, everything corresponded to the I, and since the I wasn't created by God and wasn't perfect, then they would say, well, the I is doing something, but it doesn't necessarily have to correspond to reality. So then they pose the question, what's the genuine reality? And you get in Descartes its extension, and he has a little quasi-logical proof, which is later, I think probably at the time already. I don't see it in the... I don't know if anybody actually makes the objection in the way later Berkeley did, Bishop Berkeley did, but maybe somebody already threw the card in the response papers, made the objection, but basically they show that extension also is could be understood as a secondary quality, and then it all kind of falls apart. That's where you get this fake problem with the hard problem of consciousness comes in, which is a pseudo problem, because they're trying to hold back that falling into nothingness, which is based already on a. I think the issue is really we have to look at the matters themselves, ask whether it's really cogent, and then you proceed from there on the matter of is this cogent? Should we stay with this? You can't, once you are looking all the time at the ready-made problem of primary qualities, secondary qualities, and not even remembering that they started in that form when the debate started in the 1500s. It's in Galileo, for instance. I think it heated up before Galileo even. When you're just looking at these discussions without going to the matters themselves, then this is where Heidegger steps in and says, look, somebody needs to actually look at this stuff, deconstruction. And then I think one basic path Heidegger's looking at is the Kantian manifold of acts, and from the critique of practical reason, where he's saying this factisch, I want to say manifold Handlungen, faktisch Handlungen. So this, what Heidegger turns into the ready to hand, this manifold of acts, all the things in daily life which Kant is trying to prove through the maxim are the correct way to handle the daily phronetic, as it were, sort of practical moral action. All these things, the question arises, do all these things have a pronoun behind them, or how are they being understood? And then you could say they're all to be understood as a physical quantity, or you could say there's some kind of, you could have different opinions on that. And then you have to, what Heidegger tries to do is show, here's when these aren't just taking the most famous opinion and getting on the bandwagon, but here's the way you actually test to see if it's cogent by looking. And then he tries to make avenues of invasion to approach this problem of the center of this manifold of acts, and how it's to be conceived if we're not to fall into psychologism, if we're not to fall into moralizing, but we're to see it as a question about that's the same as the question of time in the basic physics accounts.